Welcome to First Fuel, a podcast bringing you perspectives on the role of energy efficiency, energy management and demand response, and the energy transition taking place in Australia and around the world. I'm Luke Menzel, CEO of the Energy Efficiency Council, and this week I'm joined by the current CEO of auDA Domain Administration and former CEO of Energy Consumers Australia, Rosemary Sinclair. And welcome, Rosemary, and how are you travelling in this strange twilight zone between lockdown and real life that we all find ourselves in here in Australia?
Oh, hi, Luke, and it's nice to be back in the energy sector for a little while.
Indeed.
Look, travelling pretty well. Not surprising for something called .au domain administrator to be travelling okay in remote working mode.
Indeed.
I guess exploring the outer edges of the technology platform that we play a little bit of a role in, but so far so good.
Yeah, well, it certainly strikes me it's probably not a bad sector to be in at the minute. And with those virtual communications and the internet becoming more vital than ever as we navigate this new lifestyle.
Yes, and it's been an interesting experience. I walk in the door at auDA, as we call ourselves for short, and kind of 2 weeks into it, everybody's walking out the door to remote working. So fortunately, we've done a little business continuity exercise before that and found that, we could work remotely very, very successfully. So ever since the middle of March, we've been working remotely, but happily, making progress on all the matters before us quite well, quite efficiently. Combined with a couple of social get-togethers every week, we've been managing pretty well.
Oh, very, very good. And I suppose most of our listeners will be firmly embedded in the energy space, and perhaps like me, hadn't come across auDA before. And as I was looking into the organisation, it struck me that knowing your long history of advocacy in the telecommunications space, that the trip to auDA might feel like something of a homecoming, Rosemary.
Yes, it's a funny little bookend. My career in the communications sector, Luke, goes all the way back to the heady days that if you wanted to call Melbourne from Sydney, you had to call me. I was, of course, a child prodigy at that time, putting myself through university.
Right.
But we're a very long way from that to use of the internet that even those of us that have been working in the space for a long time were surprised by the very rapid change that we saw because of COVID-19. There have been discussions about online education for 20 years. There have been discussions about the use of telehealth for 20 years. But there were significant policy decisions, and they were finally made and very quickly. And then the uptake of those services has just been phenomenal. And I think we're now pretty much all of us reflecting on that experience over the last few weeks and thinking that we might not go back to the old normal, that there's been great advantage and great convenience in the way we've learned how to work and interact over the last few weeks.
I think that's right, and it's been one of the themes over the last number of episodes of First Fuel, is that we are living in a new reality, and there's been a bit of a paradigm shift in all kinds of areas, and it both goes to the experience that we've accumulated over the last number of weeks, adapting to a very different set of constraints, but also, I guess, also realising how much of the way that we live our lives and the way that we do business is cultural. There's actually we have choices about how we do things, and with the will and the motivation and the bandwidth, we can actually change things very quickly if we want to, Rosemary.
Yes, which I'm sure is a theme that we'll come back to in the course of this conversation. It's that combination of wanting to and being able to, and then having the tools to support the choice. But I think there had been, important discussions happening around the world for a couple of years now, captured by that big discussion about trust
Mm.
You know, why was there a lack of trust? What was going on? Why didn't we trust institutions or politicians or whatever big picture element we were thinking about? There was this, you know, disturbing feeling that we were off balance, that
Mm.
something was wrong.
Mm.
And I think this crisis has just provided the catalyst for us to get to what was wrong, which is that perhaps we were all living lives that we wouldn't have chosen to live if
Mm.
we'd had the prescience and time to stop and think and reflect.
Mm.
And for me, that's why people just won't rush back to the old way of living, because there has been that time to think about choices and
Mm.
new ways of doing things and living lives.
Yeah, I think that's really true. I also think that uh, there is an opportunity for government now, having, you know, across the political spectrum, played a very constructive, very admirable role, really,
Mm-hmm.
in guiding the Australian community at both the state and federal level through this crisis, where there was perhaps a trust deficit. The community has really pulled in behind government, and
Mm-hmm.
there's a window of opportunity, Rosemary, for government to use that as a little bit of a reset,
Mm-hmm.
to re-establish and reinvigorate the community's trust in public institutions. It can go in a variety of ways, and that opportunity could easily be squandered. But it's worth reflecting on for leaders, I suppose, across the community, both political leaders, but leaders of all other kinds of organisations, about how we can use this opportunity to move all kinds of balls forward.
Yes, I agree with that, Luke, and I think one of the critical outcomes of this period is a reaffirmation that the community sees a role for government that
Mm.
goes beyond just the organisation and management of markets. In certain circumstances, you know, the
Mm.
community wants government in the particular circumstance or process. So I think there's a reflection in a very deep way about that matter, the role for government, and what the community's expectations are of government. And as you say, so far so good. You know, there's an expectation about good information. There's an expectation about caring for the community. There's now, good response, I think, to the discussion that's going on about reconstructing the economy and
Mm.
keeping people in work and getting people back to work. So I think that is providing an opportunity and a platform for rebuilding trust in government.
Mm.
And again, I think it would be a terrible shame if government just went back to the old normal, when what we've seen, the national cabinets, the engagement with community organisations, with small business organisations, with big business organisations, that level of engagement in the pursuit of a shared goal, I think provides a terrific direction for what we would like to see
Mm.
in the future.
Mm. Mm. Well, we will watch with interest. I
Mm,
suppose back in our little world of energy and energy policy, I think again that our listeners tend to be in the energy space, and so will know
mm,
Energy Consumers Australia. But it's an important body, but also a relatively new one, and 5 years is
mm,
pretty new in the scheme of things in the energy space in Australia. And so I know that there will be some people that are aware of Energy Consumers Australia, Rosemary,
mm.
but don't necessarily have it completely straight in the head, the role that it plays. And this might be the last time you're ever asked to explain what Energy Consumers Australia does, but I'm going to do it. If you could tell us how it came about and what its role is, Rosemary, I would be deeply indebted to you.
Happy to do that. It's actually Energy Consumers Australia is a global first. It's one of those unsung Australian firsts that we don't take enough credit for. The idea was the result of a lot of lobbying and consultation, which really went to the fact that energy is an incredibly important service for households and small businesses, but all sorts of, incredibly important decisions are made about the sector without that voice being at the table. And so the creation of Energy Consumers Australia was a response by the Energy Council of Ministers to that dilemma, how to put the voice of consumers and small businesses at the table when big policy decisions are being made about energy sector matters. So ministers created a small organisation, Energy Consumers Australia, and gave it that remit to promote the long-term interests of consumers of energy services, and created it as a small company limited by guarantee to give it quite an independent status, but enabled ECA to participate in a range of different processes, including all the way up to the Ministerial Council. The constitution of ECA is really quite interesting because it has a quite detailed section on how the organisation is to do its work. And that led to a very significant emphasis on stakeholders of all sorts, consumer groups, consumers, industry, regulators, policymakers, ombudsmen, the raft of organisations that work together to deliver outcomes in the energy sector. But the Constitution also says that the work would be evidence-based, and that became incredibly important. It provided the ballast that enabled a new and little organisation to create its voice and to do its work on behalf of consumers and small businesses. And, there were various junctures and points where in discussions with policymakers, regulators and industry, basing the position on the voice of the consumers was absolutely pivotal to the success of the outcomes. And having said that, the creation of that new knowledge and sharing it in a collegiate and collaborative way, I think it was really the missing piece. The sector really does want to do the right thing by consumers. Having that voice at the table, I think, gave everybody a reason to engage in a different way.
And I suppose in a very tumultuous period in Australian energy policy, one of my observations of Energy Consumers Australia is you provided a safe space for a whole bunch of different stakeholders to come together and think out loud around what the future could hold and what was possible. And as you say, I think there's a lot of goodwill out there. Obviously, everybody's got a particular set of interests that they're tasked with representing, but ultimately I think most people that I encounter in the energy space want to deliver a good outcome for consumers, a good outcome for the environment, as well as a good outcome for the organisations which they represent. And Energy Consumers Australia was able to provide a framework for working out what that meant for their particular organisation or their particular role. So, I don't know if you agree with it. That was something that ECA has been able to do. But from afar, that role was really, really noticeable.
Yeah, I think it was that way of building the bridge across all the different interests and elements in the sector, because there had been a particular approach to the policy setting and regulation of the sector, which had broken the sector into constituent parts. But in fact, all those parts need to work together to get the right outcome for the consumers. And the other thing that I think was happening that made creating a place where people could share and explore ideas, I think the profound technological change that was happening also was disrupting the normal course of events, and creating the need for people to think differently and think afresh. That's very difficult to do if you see your task as defending incumbent interests. If you see the task as being part of a dialogue to get a better outcome for consumers, then it's easier to see a way into the new discussions. So I think that idea, and it was actually at the base of the foresighting forum idea, because it became clear that there was no other space really where everyone came into the room. Generators, retailers, transmission, local distribution, clean energy, energy efficiency, all the different elements, come into the room to work together on particular issues. And I think that has been pivotal. And I was amazed by the energy that kind of conversation generated, and the momentum that was then created around a range of different issues.
Well, Rosemary, one of the reasons I've invited you on today is because you're moving on to a new role, but you've played a really pivotal role in the energy space over the last 5 years. And I think that we don't necessarily do a great job of capturing insights from leaders as they move on to new pastures in their careers. And obviously there's a huge amount of knowledge and wisdom that you've built out in the energy space over the last 5 years. And I suppose one of the things that I wanted to dig into to begin with was what it was like operationalizing that vision, that bold and it sounds like unique vision that was set out by the Coag Energy Council and I guess the founding board of Energy Consumers Australia. And the things that sort of stood out to me looking back over the organisation's history was that there were probably a couple of things that helped set you on that path. And one you've mentioned, the Foresighting Forum. So you started those relatively early in the piece, and the other one was the consumer sentiment survey. And you might add others to that list, but I'm interested to know what really made the difference in terms of taking the bold vision to something which actually had some flesh on the bones, and you were able to really chart a course forward.
Well, see, the Energy Consumer Sentiment Survey, I can draw an absolute direct line from something as arcane as our Constitution, which says you will be evidence-based, to those of us who were there in the first 12 months saying, well, where is the evidence of what consumers think? Who's got that evidence? And we realised quickly that there wasn't really a body of solid evidence about what consumers were thinking about their existing experiences. And I'll come back to why I'm so specific about that in a minute. So the idea of the survey emerged in discussion in the early days. And when I say the early days, I think we had Lynn Gallagher on board, we had David Haviott on board, we had Chris Alexander on board, we had a bank account, a board and an office, but we were still exploring our role. Anyway, the idea emerged of, creating a body of evidence. And then we went from that to the second element of our way of working, which is to collaborate with people to promote the interests of consumers. So that took us in a particular direction with the survey, which in essence, Luke, reflected the fact that everybody knew things were pretty bad in terms of outcomes for consumers. And we wanted to create evidence that would help people chart the course to the future.
Mm.
So, for example, we were very deliberate in not asking consumers whether they liked their electricity bills.
Yeah.
Right. Now, we could have done that, but the answer would have been, no, I don't.
Yeah.
And that really wouldn't have helped anybody. So we went to a more consumer perspective on things, which is, do you think you're getting value from
Mm.
electricity and gas? And,
Mm.
you know, when you think about it, can you think about it relative to mobile phones and the internet and other things that make a difference in your life?
Yep.
So that created a whole discussion about how to improve value for consumers. So, you know, from the get-go, the survey started opening up discussions
Mm.
rather than closing down options. And we were looking at, you know, people's satisfaction with the market, their confidence in the market, and what they were intending to do. All of that created a language to firstly start understanding consumers in a different way, and then from that to start thinking about creating more value, helping consumers to feel more satisfied, even to reflect very deeply on why it is that consumers say to us, survey after survey after survey, I don't think this sector has my interests at heart. You know,
Mm.
kind of my nose is telling me these people are on about something else. So the survey was pivotal, Luke, and there were a number of occasions where, you know, all of us at ECA would be talking to people and we'd say, well, you might think that, but what consumers are saying is
Mm.
A, B, and C.
Mm.
So we saw that survey from the get-go as the contribution of the consumer voice to discussions that people were having where, in a sense, Luke, I suppose we trusted that the people wanted to do better and
Mm.
to get better
Mm.
outcomes,
Mm.
and therefore they would, you know, value and use the information in a positive way.
Mm.
And I think that we've seen the proof of that with the use of the survey information as a springboard to all sorts of other investigations and reflections on consumers' needs and their experiences.
So it strikes me that with the survey, what you managed to do was map out a whole new field for conversation. You know, areas that were, you know, partially understood or not understood suddenly became apparent. And to the degree that you were then advocating for consumers, you did so with a degree of moral force, because it wasn't just your kind of vibe based on, you know, what you were hearing from folk in the industry. It was based on, you know, those direct conversations and reinforced over years. And you know, doing the survey every 6 months meant that you were able to, during as I say, a pretty tumultuous period, track how consumers were feeling, and you know, then do that next level of analysis of, well, if this is what they're feeling and this is what they say they want, how do we do the heavy lifting as an industry to give them that? You know, it's not their job to provide the services or provide or come up with the tools. It's our job to meet their needs and to build a sector where at some point in the future an ECA survey can show all of us that consumers feel that the sector does have their interests at heart. And that's, I guess, got to be the ultimate goal, and I think is the goal that my impression is that the sector is rallied around, Rosemary.
Look, I'd agree with that, Luke. I think, you know, we were quite careful to ensure that the survey was robust because we wanted people to use it. And we published the survey and let people have access to the data so that they could, you know, push things around and explore from a range of different points of view. But I think that consumer sentiment survey started to pull out a range of different ways of thinking about consumers. So, for example, there was a section in it about, you know, how confident do I feel about the market? That was part of a section which asked people how confident they felt about making decisions in their own interests. And it was absolutely fascinating because people say, I feel quite confident in making decisions, but I'm not getting the information or tools that I need from the sector to be confident that my decisions are the best ones. So that does lead you to solutions and actions and responses rather than just leaving with, oh, well, the consumers aren't happy and it's all your fault. So this kind of unpacking of what the consumers wanted, that they felt, that the consumers themselves felt would help them, I think did provide people with a bit of impetus, to start thinking outside their own organisations to the outcomes that the consumers were chasing, and in innovative ways. So it kind of, I think, freed people up from, the old way of thinking and the incumbent position. It's a much better position to be in when you're trying to chase difference and change, to have that end goal in consumer language. So I think it did. I think it unlocked, quite a bit of innovation and freer thinking, because people were really focused, pardon me, on the consumers and better outcomes for them.
And I suppose also helped flesh out ECA's work plan. The big initiative that stands out to me, Rosemary, is PowerShift, the project which delivered its final report just a few months ago, while you were still CEO. Must have been incredibly satisfying to present that to the Foresighting Forum back in February. For listeners that aren't familiar with PowerShift, could you give a little bit of background on that project, what it was trying to achieve, where it drew its data from, and indeed what some of the key takeouts of the important work were?
Yeah, and I'd just like to context it a little, because you're quite right. There's a kind of a bridge from the Energy Consumer Sentiment Survey through PowerShift, and it's a bit of an iterative bridge, actually. But out of Energy Consumer Sentiment Survey, we developed an advocacy framework at ECA, which essentially said that energy services should be, from the consumer's point of view, affordable. They should be individualised. And everybody goes, what? Individualised energy services? How can we do that? But let me just leave that word on the table.
No, happy with that.
Individualised at the individual level, and then optimised at the system level. So when we then started thinking about, okay, even we drew breath at individualised, what does that actually mean? In parallel to our thinking about that, there had been an opportunity through a Commonwealth Government grant to explore the learnings of some work that had been done some years ago, the low-income energy efficiency projects. So there were 20 projects looking at energy efficiency outcomes in low-income households. And PowerShift started life as a project to say, all right, well, what have we learned from these 20 projects? Are there kind of meta lessons that we can take and apply to other low-income households in a scalable way? The way we approached that was to say, well, we really have to first of all understand households. Low-incomeness is one element of households, but if we're talking energy efficiency, then we're really talking about how people, households, make decisions about energy. So that took us down a path of really exploring households in a very innovative way. And what we came to understand was that households make energy decisions in a holistic way. The place is actually very important to your thinking about and use of energy. So all of a sudden we're starting to context energy into the lives of people, which again is the way they see it. Energy is only of interest to me because it enables me to do something else that is very important to me.
Absolutely. And this is a point that Alan Pearce made on the podcast a couple of weeks ago, which is that nobody actually cares about energy. They care about the things that energy can do for them, right?
Yes, that's exactly right. And so we learned that about households in power shift. We learned that the place in which people find themselves really matters. So if you have a substandard house or substandard non-efficient appliances, then you can be the smartest decision maker, but the context in which you find yourself is going to, stop you from getting the optimum outcome. So, we put all that together. We also learned that there weren't huge barriers. There wasn't great momentum around energy efficiency, but there weren't any insurmountable barriers. And we also did quite a bit of work on behavioural insights, how to communicate effectively with consumers so that they were put in a better position to make energy decisions. But the main lesson out of all of that is that better use of energy is critical to getting better outcomes for energy users. So a lot of work has developed out of that, but it was critical, and it was really again path-breaking work at the global level to understand energy consumer decision making in this way.
Can I ask, Rosemary, what was the thing that surprised you most coming out of that body of work? Where did you go into the Power Shift program, noting that it had iterations and evolved over time? You had one idea at the start of it and came out at the other end with a somewhat different idea.
I think the thing that interested us most was the fact that people actually value energy enormously, but it's for what it can do in their lives, and they are prepared to play a role, but communications needs to start where the consumers are, not where the energy businesses are. It needs to take account of their motivations, abilities, interests, so be individualised, if you like. But people are willing to play a role. And we were so surprised, in a sense, by that we actually started asking people, iterating back to the Energy Consumer Sentiment Survey. We asked people whether in times of emergency was our framing. If we're in a circumstance of emergency and we need you to use less power for a while, would you be prepared to do that? And this was, running counter to some quite strong arguments, because we found out, and I think we've had this reinforced recently, that if you approach Australians respectfully with a good, solid message that they can trust, then people will go with you. So in the survey, 50% of people said, oh, yes, I'd be prepared to, manage my energy use in that circumstance for nothing. 25% of people said, oh, I'd probably want a little bit of a reward for that. And then the last 25% of people said that they wouldn't be able to do that. That fitted with our research, which said that there's a range of health issues and family circumstances. There are a number of reasons why people cannot adjust the amount of energy they're using. But if the other 75% can, then we've really broken the back of the problem anyway. So that willingness to be a participant in the energy sector through choice and decision making was a very surprising and very powerful finding, because it means that we're not limited to participation through solar panels and batteries. We can get participation from the community in the energy sector in a range of different ways.
That's really fascinating. And I suppose the thing that strikes me, Rosemary, is that there's an interaction with one of the themes coming out of the final report, which was around technology and trust. And those two enabling elements. So technology is developing rapidly. We can do all kinds of things that were a glimmer in an energy wonk's eye sort of only 10 years ago. It's all getting very exciting out there in terms of automation and demand side flexibility and all of this other wonderful stuff. On the other hand, if you want to aggregate that capacity and dispatch it, you're probably not wanting to text message everybody and tell them to turn the air conditioners at the same time. You want them to have enough trust in that aggregator, indeed within the energy sector broadly, to say, well, yeah, I trust you. You're not going to, leave me baking in my apartment on a hot day. You're going to treat that trust. You're going to treat that that contract that I'm going into respectfully. So maybe it's probably not a bad sort of theme to tease out how you think about that, because there's an element of doing the work yourself, but ultimately we do need to rebuild that trust to enable some of those really big opportunities, right?
Yes, no, I think trust is the glue, if you like, that is going to enable the potential, the development and potential that we see in the energy sector. But I think that we've got some good building blocks in place now. And when I say trust in the energy sector, I think that the industry in the sector has been working very, very hard, particularly over the last few years, to regain and rebuild trust. And I've seen that, for example, in the network space with the very rapid ramp up of sophisticated consumer engagement in network determinations. And a number of examples with networks really listening very hard to their customers and then changing their decisions on the basis of the consumer preferences. And you can see that in the outcomes of the revenue decisions. I think retailers the same are really working very, very hard to rebuild trust in their consumer base. The commitment to the energy charter, the short-term COVID support responses of one sort or another, all those are elements of trust being rebuilt. I think the translation will be when we get energy sector companies really in their DNA, Luke, understanding that they are service companies, even if they own lots of metal, whether it's on rooftops or in easements or wherever, or they own lots of computer systems. Really, they are all in the business of servicing customers. I think the customers are ready for it. That's what they've been saying to us. We want to know that these companies have our interests at heart, and if we do, then we'll be prepared to move the dial on trust. And as you say, that then enables the emergence of a whole range of new services, including, technical aggregation services. So I think we're on the journey. Certainly, the technologies are emerging. It's whether this trust factor can be strengthened, and I think the way of doing that is to really focus on services to consumers.
And the other thing that, as I was looking through the report again over the last couple of days, the other thing that emerged to me was that theme of how did you put it? The context the context that consumers find themselves in. You can have the best will in the world and be trying to use energy as efficiently as you possibly can within your own home. But if it's leaking like a sieve, Rosemary, then your capacity to do that is limited. And so we get into this whole space of, well, this is kind of an energy sector conversation, but it's also a building regulation conversation. It's consumer protection conversation. It's a health conversation, and that's an area where I know that over the last couple of years, you and your team have pushed into very, very strongly. Is to make the case that there's a whole other field which interacts very closely with the traditional area of energy markets and energy market reform, and we need to start thinking about them in a joined up way.
Yes. That was a very strong message from the Power Shift body of work. It also was a strong message from the forethought research into consumer expectations. And with that research, just very briefly, what we did was we said, well, we've got a body of research now through Energy Consumer Sentiment Survey on consumers' experiences in the current market. And that's given us some, directions of travel for solutions. We understand now how consumers make decisions and how we might better communicate with consumers to help them make those better decisions. But what are their expectations around energy? How far away is the goalpost? So we started that research by thinking, wouldn't it be good to not have an energy sector conversation with consumers? Why don't we just ask people how they are living their lives and what's important to them at various phases of their life? And then once we understand that, then what role does energy play? And that is the consumer expectations research, which we released at the beginning of the year. And turns out the good news is that energy is unbelievably important to people. It's really at the bottom of the way, it's the fundamental technology that enables people to live their lives the way they want to live them and to do the things that are most important to them at any point in time. So, whether they're just young and leaving home, whether they're just in, family formation mode, happily, whatever that family looks like now, can be, beautifully diverse and, a rich tapestry of different constructions, or whether they're, responsible for younger people or whether they're older in life. Across all those journeys, energy is just fundamentally important to people. And that provides a really good start point of the possibility of recreating value and consumer appreciation. So coming out of that, it reinforced the Power Shift finding that for consumers, energy isn't a sector that sort of exists somehow by itself over here. It's part of the fabric of the way I live my life. It's embedded in everything I want to do, and going to very significant and important consequences, like keeping my elderly family members safe. I need good, reliable, easy to understand energy to keep the elder members of my family safe, or to keep the youngest members of my family safe. So that element of what do I want to do with my family and how does energy enable me to do that? Critical, absolutely critical to the way people think about the sector. The other extremely interesting insight that came out of the consumer expectations research is consumers expect energy to be clean. That debate is done and dusted in their minds. We are absolutely on this journey to clean, but it's not clean at the cost of affordable. It's not clean at the cost of reliable. It's not clean at the cost of anything, really. It's all of those things and clean. So that I thought was, a very important finding, which indicates, and the way people were talking about this indicated that people were thinking across generations.
Mm-hmm.
This is a very interesting conversation in the sector, where you get the sector policy settings and regulatory settings reflecting a view of people as economic units.
Yep.
When you actually go and talk to people, they're not just economic units. And even if you want to have the conversation about incentives and so on, you've got to design and communicate about the incentives in ways that are important to people. So, there's an important link, I think, between what we found in this research and the way the sector needs to be designed and managed. But the good news is that there's a bridge between those two, and it's about communications with consumers.
Well, Rosemary, I'm heartened to hear that Australians aren't self-identifying as economic units just yet.
Exactly.
It's incredibly encouraging. And look, as you're talking, I'm sort of thinking, well, there's all these, to deliver the value that you're talking about, we need to have a joined up conversation between a whole lot of different areas of policy and regulation that isn't really happening at the moment, or is it at a fairly embryonic stage. Last week we had the California Energy Commissioner, Andrew McAllister, on, Rosemary, and that body is one that I often reflect on, because it both sort of sets regulations for building standards, appliance standards, as well as providing that statewide policy apparatus for supply side generation infrastructure planning. And so it's in a position to properly assess, even if you're just looking at it from an economic perspective, the relative merits of regulation on one side of the market or the other. But they do have a laser-like focus on sort of obviously driving towards a clean energy system, leveraging supply side, demand side resources, but also delivering value for consumers. And while one of the things that I like to remind people of is that, while we've sort of set our hair on fire over the last 3 or 4 years around the unit cost of energy, Rosemary, in California, they have one of the higher unit costs for energy around the US, but they also have some of the lowest bills because they've been investing in energy efficiency for the last 40 years. And so, I'm sure that this would be reflected in all your work engaging with consumers. Is that my gut feel is that when I talk to people around Australia, they're much less exercised about the unit cost of energy and much more interested in what's actually on their bill at the end of the day. So have you got any thoughts on that sort of institutional or regulatory architecture in Australia, like how that conversation could be compressed now that you're in the happy position of being able to say whatever you want?
Look, I think the direction of travel, and it was starting to emerge in the last 12 months more so. I think if the focus can be laser-like on the outcomes for consumers, then I think that's where the answer lies. Up until that focus and huge effort started, there was really, I think, a belief that a few tweaks on the supply side would do it.
Yep.
It's just not that simple. It's just not that simple. And you're right. Nobody, well, I shouldn't say nobody. There was most people aren't focused on the per kilowatt. Cents per kilowatt hour of energy costs
at the level of consumer that you're
yes, that's
with.
That's right. Households and small businesses.
Yep.
Most people are saying, this bill is now X% of my total budget, and not only that, but it's gone from $100 to $300. It's growing out of control. So that's how people think about it. Which is not to say we don't want the supply side focus
Not at all.
to shift from, efficient. We
Yeah.
need that. But this notion of place, the structure of my house, and the efficiency of my appliances, and how I can make decisions about use so that I am managing the volume side, if you like, of the equation. So we've got price and volume coming together in the bill. I think there's a lot of room to move on that side. And what it suggests to me is every decision in the sector should have an element of really trying to deeply understand how to engage demand side issues, how to engage consumers, how to communicate with consumers. The days of just being able to focus on supply side, knowing that it would all come right, I think those days are done. So the re-energising of the consumer voice to deliver a range of different options on how to get stuff done, I think that's going to be critical to the future. And I suppose one of the overriding messages from all that research is that energy is so important to people. They expect to be involved, not in the detail, but they expect to be able to participate effectively in this sector so that they can be assured of the best outcomes. So I think there's an untapped role for consumers and small businesses in the sector, and we're really just at the beginning of that.
Well, I wanted to close out our time together, Rosemary, by asking you a couple of things. You're obviously moved on from the sector for the moment, focusing on the internet side of things for the minute. So for you, looking back on your time at Energy Consumers Australia, what are the things that you're really proud of and the things that you feel we really moved the ball forward on?
There are two, and they're kind of simple to say, but reflect, years of work and amazing dedication by lots and lots of people. The first is people's commitment to the conversation about how we get better outcomes for consumers. We wouldn't have made nearly the progress that was made by ECA and continues to be made by ECA without that commitment to better outcomes for consumers. People were really honest about the fact that we had, for a range of different reasons, wound up in the wrong place. And there was an appetite for doing better. So that was my first reflection, and ECA played a role in providing the way forward. People knew they needed to do better. Nobody was really happy about where things were, but not sure how to go forward. The consumer-based research and input provided that light, if you like, on the way forward. And the second thing that I'm really proud of and still interested in is the Energy Charter, which was a way for the industry at the level of CEOs. So this was, a commitment to cultural change, but the way the industry put itself back together, regulation and policy was kind of pulling it apart. But industry put itself back together with the consumers at the centre of all that work, and then provided tremendous support inside their organisations and between the organisations to have open and innovative conversations about how to get better outcomes for consumers. So that effort by industry, I think, was really important. And of course, the other matter that I was really pleased about was, the way we were able to work with our consumer colleagues and stakeholders And the work that you were alluding to earlier on better housing standards was just the most marvellous example of where, you know, 100 voices from different parts of community sector came together and worked so effectively to develop a series of recommendations and progress those recommendations to the point where, you know, decisions were made at COAG level. It was a really terrific feeling to see that momentum and joint effort work so effectively to get results.
Well, it was wonderful from the Energy Efficiency Council's perspective to support that effort in in a small way, but to watch it gather momentum and for you to have such success in transitioning what was a fairly wonky issue to kind of the centre of the conversation, and by framing it as ultimately a consumer protection issue. And one which is, it's not a nice to have, it's not, you know, a healthy, comfortable building is not something which we should feel lucky to have. It's something which we should expect, and there are minimum standards which we all need. We all need to understand, just part and parcel of living in a 21st century economy.
A kind of bottom line, a threshold issue. Yes, and it was interesting, Luke, how that framing of that issue resonated with people, and it's the same approach, if you like, that you know, figure out, you know, what is the best outcome for consumers, and that then provides a catalyst for all sorts of effort that's, you know, happening in a disparate and disconnected way to come together. And that creates the momentum for change. So it was really important, and great process.
A wonderful process, and I suppose this is your opportunity, Rosemary, for you to leave us that are still in the energy advocacy space with a to-do list of things that you didn't quite get to in your time with us, but you think unfinished business that we need to work our way through over the coming years. What are the big items that we should be turning our attention to?
Well, look, I think if I go back to the ECA advocacy framework, I think there's been quite a bit done on affordable. So there's three elements to the framework. Affordable, I think, is in the frame. As long as it stays in the frame, and when I say in the frame, I mean at the National Energy Security Board, at the annual reports of regulators and policymakers, as long as everybody is focusing on measuring and reflecting on whether energy is affordable, then we've made huge progress there. The second one is individualised, and I think there's a lot of work to be done, but a huge amount of opportunity if we can actually deliver services, tools, information, data, the odd widget or two to enable consumers to make really good decisions about energy use, then I think that's element number two. And then element number three is optimised. And this is really a message for industry and regulators. And I've said this before in so many words, the days of us being able to just throw more capacity at whatever the problem is are done. And we need the industry to really learn how to manage risk and to be agile and adaptive in its decision making, so that you know, costs for consumers will be the lowest they can be, whilst delivering the high quality energy services that consumers absolutely say they want. So I think that that's going to require, you know, new skills to be built. I think there'll be all sorts of opportunities for smart bits of technology to help in that. I think we're really just at the beginning of the technology revolution in the energy sector. And funnily enough, when I draw parallels between the communications sector and the energy sector, I'll say something very radical and provocative now, Luke. It'll be
Okay.
a fine finish to this podcast.
Thank you.
When I look at solar panels on roofs and batteries next to walls and think about interrogating and engaging every one of these little bits of widgets, it reminds me of when we all had to plug dongles into our computers and go through that conversation with the help desk to connect ourselves to the wireless network. Remember that?
Yep.
And then we got to a point where Mr. Intel said, "Oh, that looks like an unpleasant process. Why don't I just put a little chip in?" And now we open up laptops, iPads, whatever, and we just connect seamlessly. I think that we're just at the beginning of that phase of revolution in the energy sector. We will wind up with everything generating power and feeding that power to where it's needed. We're just at the beginning of enormous opportunities, and it's going to be great fun, I would say, for the energy sector.
I think that's absolutely right. And Rosemary, sometimes my members at the Energy Efficiency Council get a bit down in the mouth because they haven't been up the sexy end of the energy debate over the last 10 years. But the thing that I'm always happy to remind them is that we're moving from a world which is about centralised generators and energy running down big power lines and buildings hanging off the edge of the energy network, to a world where buildings are the energy network, and you've got a very diverse and disparate range of resources that need to be coordinated in real time to deliver an optimised outcome for consumers and for the entire system. So, so I'm able to say to them, Rosemary, that what energy managers are going to inherit the earth in one way, shape, or form. So don't worry.
and that's why I don't think I've gone very far, Luke. When I think about the energy sector and the Internet of Things.
Indeed.
I feel very close.
Well, I'm fairly confident we're going to keep the conversation going for that very reason. I think the intersections are only going to become more apparent as time goes on, Rosemary. But for now, I'm happy to say thank you. And I suppose I should note, we were really pleased to formally kind of align ourselves with Energy Consumers Australia 2 or 3 months ago, when your former organisation became a not-for-profit partner of the Energy Efficiency Council, noting some really good collaboration that had occurred over a number of years, but just putting a bit of a framework around that. And we're continuing to work with Lynn and the team and their incredible work that you've kicked off, but is going to be carried forward by that new leadership. So it's an important role, but thank you, Rosemary, for your contribution over the last 5 years. And looking forward to seeing what's next in the storied career of Rosemary Sinclair.
Well, thanks very much, Luke, for the opportunity to just chat with you about it. I left ECA, joined auDA, and then went into lockdown. So you've even created an opportunity for me to reflect that hadn't been there. So I really enjoyed chatting with you.
Yeah, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you, Rosemary. So that brings this episode of First Fuel to a close. If you have comments, you can find us on Twitter. My handle is @Luke_Menzel, and to keep up to date on the latest in energy efficiency, energy management and demand response, follow the Energy Efficiency Council @EE_Council. And Rosemary, we did look up your Twitter handle, but I understand.
You promised.
I understand that you need to update that before we direct people to it. So perhaps LinkedIn is the best place to find Rosemary if you're looking to connect with her after this episode. If Twitter is not your thing, you can email the team. The address is firstfuel@eec.org.au. We'd love it if you could leave us a review, a rating, or even both on Apple Podcasts. It will help like-minded energy geeks find the show. And of course, some episodes, including this one of First Fuel, are broadcast as they're recorded. So you can jump on Zoom, listen in live, and contribute a question in the chat. For a full listing of upcoming recording times, visit eec.org.au/podcasts. But for now, it's goodbye from us, and we'll catch you soon.